Hey everybody, we got a lot planned today. We are going to do some maintenance on the 125. We're going to get in there and do a nice water change. I've got to get in there and get the glass wiped down and get that all cleaned up. And most importantly, I'm going to get in there for the first time and do a big filter change. This is a fairly new tank, and I've been letting the external canister filter just run and do its thing while the nitrifying bacterial colony is established and became well established. Now that they are, it is time to get in there and do a filter change. I know a lot of people let their external canister filters run for very long periods of time between changes, but I do not recommend doing that. I usually get in there about once a month and do some basic filter maintenance. So that is going to be today. We're going to do the big water change and wipe down the glass. And I've also been doing some testing with my source water, my groundwater versus my conditioned water after it goes through my system, and I found out some more interesting tidbits. So we might talk a little bit more about my water today. I just shot a video about total dissolved solids, and that's why my brain's kind of in gear for the TDS. So we will probably be talking a little bit about total dissolved solids and what's going on in my tank and what's going on with my water and why I've made it the way I've got it, etc., etc. Like I say, big day today. This is probably going to be a big video. I don't really know where it's going to go at this point. I haven't even really gotten started other than tinkering with some of the water testing that I've been doing. So let me get started and we will see where we go from here. Alright, we've begun the process of draining the tank. This is going to take a while because if you are familiar with my water change videos, you know I like to do big ones. So we're going to do at least a 50% water change today. And the main reason we're going to do that is because of all the tannins that are building up in the water. If you will notice, the tank is very tea-stained and very dark. The before and after we'll get at the very end will give you a much more clear idea of how tannin stained the water actually is. So, talking a little more about the total dissolved solids, I said yesterday in the video I did, I was talking about doing a water change. I was talking about this tank and the number of total dissolved solids in the tank versus the source water, and I pointed out how there was 125 or something like that additional parts per million that had built up in the tank since putting the fresh water in the tank. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that that's 100 parts per million of nitrates. It is not. That is 100 parts per million of total dissolved solids. Again, it's just the total number of everything that has dissolved into that tank. So the phosphates that are building up in that tank count for that number. And in this particular case, the tannins or tannic acid is also an organic that builds up in the tank. So when you do a simple TDS count, you get everything. It counts every dissolved solid that is in that water. And in this case, I've got a lot of tannins in the water. So that also goes towards showing a very high number, which again, if you understand where that number comes from and what that means, it is obviously nothing I need to worry about or panic about. My water is stable enough and I have enough buffers in my water that the tannins building up have very little effect on my pH. We can get into that in just a moment. We can go over and look at my scientific test station, the top of my washing machine, where I do all my water testing, and we can talk about why my water is so stable yet so soft. It comes out of the ground very, very soft. In fact, I just checked it and I have zero hardness coming out of the ground. And I have about 180 parts per million dissolved solids in there. Now, I know I've got quite a few nitrates in my water, so they count as dissolved solids. Again, I cannot take that number and say, oh, I've got this much hardness or that much hardness based on this number of TDS. All I can say is I have this much of something in the water that gives me this number of dissolved solids. And in my case, I do know that I have quite a bit of nitrates in the water, so that counts for about 30 to 40 parts per million. And then who knows what else could be dissolved in there. It could be just about anything. But I actually see 0 degrees hardness, so I have very little or no calcium and magnesium dissolved in my water. My water softener does not, in fact, actually soften my water. The first thing it does is it hardens my water, which brings the pH from 6 all the way up to 7.3, where the sodium ions in there stabilize it, and that's why I have very stable water, because sodium is a buffer like calcium or magnesium, but does not account for hardness. So I have 0 hardness, but a lot of buffer and a 7.3 pH. Are you confused enough yet? Once we get to talking about water hardness, you're going to get really confused, because there are no less than 4 different types of water hardness that might be regularly referred to, depending on who you're talking to and what you're talking about. So water hardness tends to get really complicated and confusing, and all of that is involved with the TDS and so on and so forth. It just goes on and on and on. But we are going to go over to my test station here in a minute, and we're going to start looking at a little bit of what's going on with this water, and maybe we'll look at a little bit of what's going on with my groundwater, and we'll make some comparisons, and maybe we'll chat a little bit more about what my water system does and how I treat it before it goes into the tank. As I said, we got plenty of time while I let this work. Alright everybody, here we are. While the tank is draining, let's take a look at a little bit of this. I'm going to show you some important test results. I know that looks like an awful lot, and I actually have run tests on most of that stuff, but what's significant at the moment is these 3 vials that we're looking at. If you'll notice, the 2 are very, very similar in color, and 1 is very different. This is my groundwater, untreated. That is my tap water after it goes through my system, and that is water that has come right out of the 125. So if we look at these vials are the pH. My groundwater has a pH of 6. It is very acidic. My tap water has a pH of about 7.3, maybe a little bit higher than that. And then the water in my tank has a pH of about 7.2, maybe 7.1. Sits right above neutral, right around neutral. That's about what I would expect. The tannins and the CO2 that builds up in there actually do lower the pH slightly over time, so I'm not worried about that in any way. But why is it significant that I've got acidic water at the start and I've got neutral water at the end? And I'm going to further show you a test we can do. This is my TDS meter. So if we look at my groundwater, it takes about 30 seconds for the test to actually stabilize, but my groundwater has somewhere around 180 parts per million. Don't know if you can read that or not. There is a hold button that I can set, so I think that's showing 203 right there. I've been testing this water over and over again, and it's come out at about 180 every single time I've done it until now. We're showing 205. So that is my groundwater. This is my tap water, and this should be significantly higher, about 50 or 80 parts per million higher. Again, I can't really see it on camera there. So far it's showing 250, so we're about 50 parts per million higher. That's what I would expect. And then if we test the tank water is going to be well over 400. Now it's going to jump way up, and then it'll start climbing back down. So this settles down to around 445 to 450 usually. And when I say usually, I mean in the times I've been testing it here over the last 10 minutes or so. So why do I have more dissolved solids in my water after it's gone through my system than before? And of course the tank is something altogether different. Well, this is why. I have that great big green canister right there is my neutralizer. So what's happening is the water is coming out of the ground fairly acidic. That's why it has that fairly low total dissolved solids number. I actually tested the water, and it tested 0 for hardness, so those are not calcium and magnesium ions that are in the water. So my water softener is not doing anything to that. What it's doing is it's actually adding calcium and magnesium, and then that brings my pH up to neutral. It then goes through, well, a little higher than neutral actually. I have it set, there's a valve on the back, I can adjust it to whatever I want, and I have it set to make it a little above neutral. It then goes through that unit, which is the actual softening unit. And since my water has now had the calcium and magnesium added to it, I've actually hardened the water in the process of raising the pH. So the softener now softens the water by taking out what I just put in. However, the sodium ions that are exchanging for those calcium and magnesium ions are also pH buffers, and they lock the pH where I set it. So I've removed the hardness, but I've stabilized the pH. It then goes through this unit, which is a BioLite, and it's a very intense ultraviolet light. And then it goes into my water system, and then we pour it right here into this cup, and then that goes into my tanks or my test files or whatever we're looking at. So that's how my system works, and that's how I can do these tests, and I can cross-check and cross-reference these things. I can look at the low pH. I know that it does not have a lot of buffer in the groundwater. I know it's got a low dissolved solid count, and I know it's got a 0-degree hardness count. I can factor all those numbers together and come up with some idea of what's in my groundwater. I can then do some math and figure out the total dissolved solid count from start to finish through the water system, and I can actually find out more about what's being taken out of my water and what's being put in my water, etc. So all of this stuff that I always talk about with total dissolved solids is really dependent on what those solids are, and as I said before, you generally need to know a lot of other information in order to establish what these dissolved solids are. So don't get too hung up on that TDS number. Like I said in the other video, you've got to be on the little more advanced side to start really picking into your water and finding out what's what and why it's in there and how it got there and that sort of thing. But I'm going to get back to it. The next stage is going to be getting in there and wiping down the glass. I actually use some of this material. It's the same stuff I use in my filters. We'll be seeing more of this later. I just cut a little piece of that off. I use it to wipe the glass down. I like using this better than scraping, because when you scrape, it actually just scrapes all that stuff loose into the tank. This actually holds some of it. You still do get a lot in the water column, but this holds on to some of it, and you can gently remove it from the tank, throw it away, and use a fresh piece, and it actually helps remove some of the algae that you're wiping off the glass and get it out of the tank altogether. So let me get on that, and we will go to the next stage of this video. Alright everybody, here we are back over at the tank. Just want to add a few thoughts before we get too much further into this. I've already wiped the glass down, and I have actually used a bucket and my hand vac to vac the tank to some degree. I don't like the way this siphon vacs. It pulls some stuff out, but I usually use that more to drain and to fill than to actually clean, because it just doesn't have a very powerful suction on it. So I use the hand vac when I want to do some actual vacuuming. So we will be pouring that water out in a few moments, and then if you will notice, Blossom, Bubbles, and Buttercup are defending my canister filter from Mojo Jojo, so we will be opening that up very soon and getting into the filter. But in the meantime, like I said, I want to have a little bit more of a discussion about what's going on with my water and why I can do these massive water changes and why you maybe should not, depending on what your water does and does not do. A lot of people have water that comes out of their tap at 1 pH, and if they let it sit overnight, it turns into another pH within 24 hours or less. More often than not, this is caused by high levels of dissolved carbon dioxide in the water, and when it degasses, the pH rises fairly rapidly. So you can test your water, and you can think you're putting nice acidic water in your tank, or even neutral water in your tank, and then within a day or so you've actually got 7.6 or 8.2 pH, and your fish can't deal with that. So doing a massive water change like the one we're doing here, and I'm only about 3/4 of the way there. I want to lower the water level about 5 more inches before we're done with this. If you don't know what you're doing with your water, that can be a really big shock to your fish. You can change all sorts of parameters in your tank by doing these really massive water changes. I can do them because of what we just looked at. I do a great deal of things to my water to make it not only what I want, but to make it stable, so that when we get right down to it, if I had to, I could actually have that hose running into the tank at one end and have another hose running out of the tank at the other. And in fact, I do that on a fairly regular basis, and I just sort of flush the tank, and I can do more or less 100% water changes without doing any real shock to my fish. It doesn't really change my water parameters in any way. So I just wanted to throw in that little disclaimer. Again, just because you see me doing things does not mean that's the way you should do them. This is how I manage my tanks. I know a lot about what's going on with my tanks, and I know a lot of things that you don't necessarily know just from the casual observation. So if you try to do the things I do, you may actually run into issues, and I would not recommend doing these massive water changes like this. If you're not really familiar with what you're doing, stick to the guidelines of 10% weekly and 25% monthly, and check your nitrates, check your nitrites, check your ammonia from time to time, and you should be good. So I'm going to get on working on that filter. We'll probably shoot a little bit of video looking at the insides of what a canister filter looks like. We'll find out how dirty it is, since this is going to be the first time I've cracked it open since we got this tank set up and running. I also have some secret good news that I'm going to add in later in this video, so stay tuned. Alright, we're at the next step, and we're going to start tearing the filter down. As you can see, I've already got the top pulled off. And this filter comes with a nice little valve, and you just pull the hoses right out the top. I believe the older models you actually had to unscrew them from the top of the tank, and it was a little bit more of a pain in the bottom trying to get all this taken apart. This is no big deal. You just unplug it, close that valve to seal the lines off, and then you get into this. If you look under this, that light right there is my UV sterilizer that goes in this tank. When this fits on top, it goes right down the hole that you can see right there. So the first tray is my bio balls, and then underneath of that I've got the padding that comes with it. That's a little bit of extra filtration, so that doesn't look too bad. Let me try switching hands here, see if this works a little better. These are just pot scrubbies. Sorry, I'm looking at my hands rather than the camera. And then the filter pad that again came with it, which looks pretty dirty, but the pot scrubbies actually look pretty good. I'm surprised they're not a little more clogged with bio gunk. All that bio bacteria gets looking nasty. So my ceramic rings aren't even starting to brown up yet, so this filter really probably didn't even need to be touched today. We will get down to the bottom tray, and that'll be where the actual filtration is, and we'll see what that looks like. So it's, you know, time to change it. It's certainly not a bad thing that I got in here to do this. Alright, and here we are a little while later. We are now filling the tank back up. This process usually takes a while, so that'll give us a few moments to sit and chat. Did want to make a few little points about tending to details. If you will notice here off to the left, my heater is fully exposed. Always make sure you unplug your heater when you're doing one of these water changes. You never want one of those heaters plugged in when they're exposed to air. They are designed to have the heat pulled out of them very quickly in water. If they're allowed to heat up in the atmosphere, they get very, very hot very quickly. They will actually burn the skin right off of you. The glass can shatter and everything else. So you never want them plugged in unless they are in the water and fully submerged. Or, you know, at least right up to that neck. Another point to remember is, remember to plug them in when you're done. I had a viewer one time point out a good tip for me. You will notice the cabinet door. I know it's a little hard to tell because I got the overhead lights off again. But the door to the filter cabinet is open. So while my heater is unplugged, that door stays open. That way, worst case scenario, when I go around to make my rounds and turn all the lights out tonight, I will undoubtedly notice that door is open, and that will be my reminder to plug the heater back in, and I will not forget to do that because I have done that, as we all have, many times in the past. So one of the other things I wanted to tell you is I have some other Congo tetras. I have 4 male Congo tetras that I have had in quarantine down here. You will notice I have all my draping and everything up that I've hung up because I was doing a little more elaborate video today. That's why we haven't been having any glare or reflection in the background. But if you will notice, I've got the 4 male Congo tetras in the holding tank right there. They've been in there for 2 weeks now. Well, technically it's 2 weeks tomorrow, but since I'm doing all of this today is the day they're getting moved in. So when we look at the after, and from now on, when we look at video of this tank, it is going to have 7 males and 3 females. So, no, I'm sorry, 7 males and 4 females. So we're going to have a lot of color and a lot of action as those males compete for the attentions of the females. As I've pointed out before, my Congos pretty much continually spawn, so we will get a lot of good stuff from that. So another thing I want to point out is this would not be a proper Dan water change if I didn't get some hydrogen peroxide in there somewhere. If you will notice all of the bubbles all over that green gunky stuff, That is hydrogen peroxide doing its work. When the water level was low enough, I actually sprayed the surface of that a little bit. I sprayed these rocks down a little bit. You can see all that green growing on there. I've already got a lot of cyanobacteria in this tank, and it annoys me. So this piece of wood has a lot of green on it as well, and I've sprayed that down, but I'm not getting much reaction. So I'm not really sure what's going on with that and what that green actually is. Some things are a little resistant to hydrogen peroxide. It does not kill everything, and it doesn't kill instantaneously. You can't just spray it on something and expect it to die. It has to stay on there for a length of time. So this is just a little bit of a spot treatment. It'll sort of keep it at bay, as I usually do in all of my tanks. And again, I've got a UV sterilizer on this, so any that gets knocked loose into the water column will get killed as it goes through the UV sterilizer. I think that's about all I can think of off the top of my head. Again, I want to remind you not to do massive water changes like this. And I did have one other final point to make. In my other video where I mentioned the water change, and I gave the impression that I was basing that water change decision on my TDS number, I want you to consider this. We just looked at this tank, and it had a TDS of 450 parts per million, roughly. Well, only 40 of those parts for every 450 were nitrates. So you cannot go by the TDS number and say, wow, that's a high number. We know that I have at least 280 parts per million of sodium. We know that the tannins that build up in the tank account for dissolved solids. We know that phosphates in the tank account for dissolved solids, and so do many, many other things. So that 450 number, while large and scary sounding, only 40 parts per million nitrates were in this tank. I had no ammonia and I had no nitrites. So the only thing I was really accomplishing by doing this was removing some of the nitrates. I do like to keep it a little lower than that if I can. And then just removing a lot of the tannins, so we'll have a nice clean tank. And while I was in there, I was able to get the glass wiped down. So when we do the before and after here in a few minutes, we will get to see a beautiful, beautiful difference of a nice brightly lit tank. And I am about to get in there and pull some of that water sprite out as well, so there'll be a lot more light getting to the bottom. So sit tight, and we will go ahead and wrap this up with the before and after and any final thoughts at the end. Alright, there's the after. Now, I don't really have any final thoughts on this tank. I think we've pretty much covered everything that I wanted to talk about today. We will continue the discussion about total dissolved solids. I can't remember whether I mentioned it or not. I want to talk about water hardness at some point. There are no less than 4 types of water hardness, so it can get pretty complicated. So I want to get in there and start digging around and sorting out all the weird different measurements and etc., etc. It gets strange when you get into water hardness. There is temporary hardness, permanent hardness, carbonate hardness, and then just regular old hardness, general hardness. So we will get into discussing that very soon. Look forward to that. And if you have stayed with me all this time, I will give you another little teaser video. And we will go look right here real quickly at my 40 breeder that I am cycling in. I did not discard my water sprite. I just put it in here for a little while. This tank is cycling in, so I'm getting a little bit of ammonia so far, but no nitrites. So this tank is very, very slowly cycling in. No video on this yet other than these sort of brief updates. And if you notice the container of water up there, I am running another experiment on my water down here. Letting that degas overnight to see what happens to it. So stay tuned for a little short video about that as well. So if you're not already subscribed, please do so. As you can tell, I do lots of little tinkering odds and ends things that are always fun to watch and interesting to learn from. So stay tuned for that. Again, subscribe if you're not already. If you are, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed watching this one. I thank you for watching it, and I will see you on the next one.